Students, in today's class, we shall discuss concepts of third cinema. Third cinema is an alternative mode of filmmaking which was developed in 1950s, 60s and 70s in many third world countries in different parts of the world. Actually, after the Second World War, the world underwent through a massive change. Many countries in Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world won their freedom from colonial rules. Now, in those countries, a new trend of national cinema developed which critically understood colonialism and the influence of colonial power in post-colonial countries. Third cinema came up through this way. Originally, the breeding ground of third cinema was Latin America. Though Latin American countries won their freedom in 19th century, in early 19th century, but after the Second World War, Latin American countries suffered from neo-colonial aggression in their lands. Particularly after the Second World War, USA appeared as the most powerful neo-colonial force in the world. Since Latin American countries are the neighboring countries of USA, particularly through Mexico, Cuba, US influence entered into Latin America. And the neo-colonial force, USA tried to control their politics, economy, and culture. Now, apart from political and military control of neo-colonial forces in Latin America, there was another major aspect, which was the influence of Hollywood. Hollywood as the cultural vehicle of neo-colonialism captured Latin American markets. Now, under the influence of Hollywood, Latin American cinema underwent a rickety condition where there was a dependence on a dependence on Hollywood cinema was built purposefully. Now, in Mexico, Cuba, Brazil, Bolivia, Argentina, many filmmakers since late 1950s was struggling to develop a completely new cinema which successfully resisted the influence of neo-colonial Hollywood cinema in their countries. Later, in 1960s, the cinemas from the revolutionary cinemas from Latin American countries consolidated as third cinema. Particularly, cinema of revolution in Cuba, cinema novo movement in Brazil, and cinema of liberation movement in Argentina contributed a lot in the formation of the idea of third cinema. For the development of third cinema, three important manifestos we can consider and we can mention. One is Garcia Espinosa's For an Imperfect Cinema. Espinosa was a post-revolution Cuban filmmaker who wrote a manifesto for an imperfect cinema. Second is Glover Rocha's Aesthetics of Hunger. Glover Rocha was a filmmaker who belonged to Cinema Novo movement of Brazil. Third, and the most important contribution was from Fernando Solanas and Octavio Getino. They belonged to Argentine Cinema of Liberation movement. The manifesto written by them was entitled as Towards a Third Cinema. So, these three manifestos, For an Imperfect Cinema, Aesthetics of Hunger, and Towards a Third Cinema, finally consolidated the idea of third cinema, first in Latin America, and then the idea of third cinema was spread all over the world, particularly in African countries and Asian countries. Now, our first concern is why this resistance cinema is known as third cinema. That means, what were first cinema and second cinema? The first cinema was Hollywood cinema, which was, according to Fernando Solanas, is a cinema of surplus value, which tried to use cinematic medium for entertainment and business purpose and to accumulate profit by using cinematic by using cinema as a means of business. The second cinema they mean was European art cinema. Also, European art cinema includes Soviet socialist realist cinema. This kind of European art films, they were made for consumption of elite audience. So, Latin American filmmakers was against this kind of elite cinema too. Now, the concept of third cinema, therefore, is a certain kind of cinema which consciously separates itself from Hollywood cinema, which is entertainment based, and European cinema, which is based on avant-garde artistic practice. So, the goal of third cinema is to make a kind of cinematic culture which reflects people's culture. So, third cinema distances itself from Hollywood cinema, which was the cinema of entertainment, and European art cinema, which was the cinema of elite consumption. Now, third cinema proposes a new kind of cinema which would reflect people's culture. In order to construct the idea of third cinema, the third cinema filmmakers were against Hollywood cinema and they were critics of European cinema. The ultimate goal of third cinema was decolonizing consciousness. According to the third cinema intellectuals, the consciousness of the colonial countries which won freedom were dependent consciousness. Their consciousness depends on the education, culture, and economy imported to their land by the colonial rules. So, the first and foremost objective of third cinema was decolonizing the minds of post-colonial people. Now, so the final goal of the cinema is said as liberation from all kinds of neo-colonial influences. Now, after the colonial rule in Latin America particularly, Latin American liberation was completely occupied, snatched by the US neo-colonial powers and forces. So, one very important goal of third cinema was to combat with the influence of neo-colonial power and to liberate people's mind from the influence of neocolonialism. If we summarize the objectives of third cinema, we can say that aesthetically, third cinema affords the neglected of marginalized culture of the erstwhile colonial countries, which has potential towards resisting the colonial and neocolonial cultural hegemony. Socially speaking, third cinema uncovers the cause of underdevelopment in post-colonial countries. Third, politically speaking, the goal of third cinema is to guide people towards liberation struggle and revolutionary endeavor for decolonizing their countries. There are three major influences in third cinema filmmaking. One influence is the influence of Italian neorealism, that many filmmakers from Latin America who later constructed the concepts and ideas of third cinema as a kind of committed cinema, as a kind of cinema which is umbilically related to the immediate reality of everyday life. They were inspired very much by neorealist filmmakers. The second influence was coming from the theory of Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, famous book, where Fanon actually tried to uncover the psychological and cultural development towards nationalism in colonial countries, largely inspired the third cinema filmmakers. And finally, the political activity and ideas of Che Guevara. Che was an Argentine doctor who later went to Cuba, participated in Cuban Revolution, and for a few years he was in Cuba. Then he went to Congo to join the revolutionary freedom struggle of that country, and then he went to Bolivia where he died. Now, the idea of Che Guevara, the idea of new man Che Guevara, which Che Guevara introduced in Latin American culture, in the culture of international revolutionary forum, that the idea of new man, the new social being, which is free from the influence of colonial rule, which is free from the influence of capitalist oppression on him. Now, this idea of new man inspired third cinema filmmakers, and which is reflected in their effort to construct a people's cinema. Why it is people's cinema? Because this kind of cinema tells the reality of the common people, the downtrodden people, the down to earth people. This cinema is inspired from the stories of the lives of common people, and finally this cinema, third cinema, must be committed to the causes of common people. So from the very beginning, from production to exhibition, the objective of third cinema is to tell the story of common people with the aid and help from them. One great example is Hour of the Furnaces, made by Solanas and Hetino. In this film, which we observe that the film from the beginning was made by crowdfunding, and finally most of the exhibitions of the film were done among the common people in common places.
Subdesarrollo.
Two major areas in which third cinema tried to intervene were history and people's culture. First of all, third cinema filmmakers tried to intervene into history because, according to them, the colonial and neo-colonial forces taught us a wrong history, a wrong concept of past, a wrong concept of development and underdevelopment. So they intervene into history. For example, Globe Rosa's film Black God, White Devil, or Usman Semben, a Senegalese filmmaker, whose film Hala. For example, we can watch these films, how third cinema tries to bring in a alternative concept of history, which is not the history of ruling class, but a history of common people, a history of revolutionary and struggling people.
Do lado de lá tem ouro do mar. Tem pão feito de pedra.
Nada, só tem fome
Tem
e
os
morte.
cavalos
Uma luz pra ver,
comendo
Rosa.
as flores.
Você tem que ter uma fé. Caminha na escuridão.
Maria, cheia de graça, o povo entre as mulheres. Bendito é o fruto do ventre, Jesus. Santo Maria, de Deus, ora por nós, pecadores, agora e na hora de nossa morte. Amém.
Monsieur le ministre, Messieurs les députés, honorables collègues, jamais dans le passé, un Africain n'a occupé la présidence de notre Chambre. Nous devons prendre ce qui est à nous, ce qui nous revient de droit. Nous devons contrôler notre industrie, notre commerce, notre culture, en un mot, prendre en main notre destinée.
The second is third cinema filmmakers focuses on those cultures, cultural forms which were oppressed by colonial and neo-colonial powers and which belongs to the downtrodden people's culture. For example, Nelson Pereira dos Santos, Brazilian filmmakers, his film Rio North Zone, which shows the life of a samba singer who composed many beautiful sambas but never acknowledged by the culture industry.
Você vai me levar toda essa patelada. Vou tirar suas melodias, senão isso desaparece. Passe lá em casa, hein?
Tá certo. Maurício? Ei, Maurício?
Ô, parceiro, como vai você?
Bem. Eu tava procurando você porque...
Foi bom. Eu estava mesmo precisando falar contigo. Passa aí amanhã. O negócio vai bem, velho. Já tô trabalhando um novo cantor pro meio do ano. Vai ser um tiro.
Mas acontece que eu tô duro. Queria ver se você me arranjava algum.
Eu também tô a nenhum, sabe? Passa aí amanhã, talvez eu dê um jeito.
Mas não é muito, Maurício.
Mas eu já lhe disse que eu tô pronto, velho. Você vai pra lá?
Bem, eu queria...
Então até logo, sim.
Eu vou caminhando contigo.
Mas eu estou com um pouquinho de pressa.
Eu sei, Maurício. Mas eu só queria saber quando é que a gente vai assinar o contrato.
Pois é isso. O mexi com ela?
Sei.
O Alaor me disse, você sabe, eu acho que você não devia ir na gravação.
O samba foi gravado?
So these are two major areas where third cinema filmmakers tried to reconstruct radically the concepts of people. One is history and second is people's culture. Now let us quote a passage from Teshome Gabriel's article, Third Cinema as a Guardian of Popular Memory. Teshome Gabriel is one of the best intellectuals who wrote brilliantly on third cinema. Let's quote Teshome Gabriel. As originally conceived, Teshome Gabriel says, the impetus of third cinema was and continues to be participatory and contributive to the struggles for liberation of the peoples of the third world. At present, these struggles are of two types. In those regions of the third world where the battles for history and around history are ever more intensified, the original manifesto of camera as a gun still holds there. In those other regions where the major battles have moved into the cultural front, including the efforts of minorities and progressives in the West, the conjunction of cinema and struggle takes on a new dimension. Nevertheless, in whatever form, this retains similar strategies both to recover popular memory and to activate it. For this is the passion which fires third cinema of various types. So, one should remember that third cinema is not a particular movement or particular style of filmmaking. Third cinema is a concept of alternative filmmaking which may vary from one country to other. But the ultimate goal of third cinema is to contribute in revolutionary and liberation struggle and finally to decolonize the post-colonial people's mind. Now, after 1960s, after the initial period, third cinema spread in Africa particularly in the films of Usman Sembène, we find the influence of third cinema. In Asia, also in our countries, the filmmakers like Mrinal Sen was highly influenced by third cinema aesthetics and politics, and the idea of third cinema in this way spread all over the world in 1970s. Even in European countries, some European filmmakers like Gillo Pontecorvo of Italy or Lindsay Anderson of United Kingdom, they embraced the idea of third cinema. So students, this is an overview of third cinema. Now, in today's world, third cinema is not operative in its older form, but still we must understand that the influence of third cinema exists in the filmmaking of many filmmakers around the world, particularly in the filmmakers of Asia, Africa and Latin America, even if today